Okay, I think we'll get started. I want to welcome everybody to our Thursday after lunch IT webinar series. Very, very timely, especially considering today and what we're experiencing around the country, the impact of telework on cybersecurity across the federal government. So it should be a great topic today, very timely. And boy, it's almost been a year since we've been through this pandemic, and it's just continuously impacting us. My name is Tom Suter. I'm the CEO and founder of ATARC, the Advanced Technology Academic Research Center, and I have the pleasure of moderating today's panel. I want to welcome all the attendees. I know you're taking time out of your busy day. Hopefully this topic will be on point to what you're doing in your day-to-day work. But we want to give special thanks to Shamali Deshpande, Akiko Honda, Jeff Frederick, and the rest of the Yubico team. And they've been a great partner of ATARC's, and we really appreciate them working with us on putting together this program today. So here's what we're going to do. This afternoon, we're going to hear from our panelists. We're going to follow up with some Q&A, and we are going to pop in a poll or two or three, keep things going, and then we're going to answer your questions. So this is always, as many of you tune into these on a regular basis, very interactive. So we really appreciate you joining us, and we want to get to all your questions. So if I can bring all the panelists on and in person and see your bright and shiny faces, we'll do some quick introductions, and then we'll go into some deep dive. But okay, looks like we got a full house. Welcome, Lisa Palma. Lisa is the cybersecurity specialist for identity and access management at the United States Department of International Development. How are you doing today, Lisa?
I'm doing well, Tom. Thank you.
Good, good. It looks like, I think you're working out of your home office, or you in the
No, I'm in the home office. Yes.
Gotcha. Thank you. Next, we have Ross Ford. Ross is a senior engineer at the Cybersecurity Division of CISA, the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Agency over at DHS. How are we doing today, Ross?
Great afternoon, Tom. Got a little snow outside, but it's I think we're in better shape than a lot of people in the country. So
I know. I think you're right. Thank you, Ross. Next, we have Joe Ramsey. Joe is Director of IT Security / CISO at International Trade Administration at the United States Department of Commerce.
Hi, thanks for having me here.
Yep, good to see you, Joe. And you're in the home office, I think?
I am indeed.
Good. Next, we have Jeremy Grant, who is formerly many of us know him and met him when he's formerly a senior executive advisor at the National Strategy for Trusted Identities in Cyberspace over at NIST, and now he is a managing director over at Venable. How are we doing today, Jeremy?
I'm cold, Tom, but trying to stay warm. So I'm glad to be here today.
Good to see you. Is that a virtual background, or it looks like kind of
I'm in the home office like everybody else. This is just a Venable virtual background. That's a blurry wall with some art in our office. That's a little more exciting than what I've actually got behind me.
Gotcha. Full disclosure, I'm not in Roslyn on a rooftop or looking out a window, but
it looks a lot like a much nicer day in DC than I'm seeing on my window.
Yeah. So it's always glass half full here with my background. I think it's the fall too. I probably needed to up my background game. I at least need to go a little bit seasonal. And last but certainly not least, we have Jeff Frederick, who's a senior solutions engineer at Yubico. How are you doing today, Jeff?
I'm well, Tom. I'm well. Thank you.
Yep. And where are you located?
I am also in the home office in Virginia. It's a little snowy down here too. I had to shovel the deck off to let the dogs out in the backyard.
Fantastic. Yeah, just a little icy today. So anyway, why don't we get right into it? Maybe we can start off with you, Lisa, and kind of like go through your story. I mean, USAID, very well documented. You're working around the globe. You're dealing with partners. Identity is a big issue. Just want to hear what the latest and greatest is and how you've been working with your mission in the middle of a global pandemic.
Right. Okay. Well, we are here. We've implemented HSPD 12 and OMB 1111, and we emerged right into ICAM and implementing OMB 1917. And we are, just like a lot of agencies with user populations overseas as well, we have to constantly keep up with standards to be able to transition into NIST 63.3 and adopt other authenticators to keep the strengthen the security posture to keep us safe. We're very heavily involved with, staying up to date with the standards, bringing them in where they can fit our requirements, mapping requirements into compliance mapping with the guidelines. And like every other agency, we are doing that in the middle of a global pandemic. It's going to be an interesting afternoon on this conversation.
Thank you, Lisa, for that. And next, maybe we'll go with you, Joe. And ITA is one of the best kept. I mean, it's not a secret, but it's one of the coolest little agencies out there where they have a very interesting mission. And you also are doing a lot of work overseas.
We are approximately 2/3 of our workforce is deployed outside of our headquarters location. So we're a very international focused organization. And for longer than I've been at ITA, we've been a very cloud focused organization as well, which has served us well during the pandemic and having everyone working from home during this. But we are over 99% deployed in the cloud. We have some of the same identity challenges, both domestically and internationally that were just mentioned. But a lot of what we've been doing has been accelerated by the pandemic, but we're basically heading in the same direction that we were.
Great, thank you. And next, why don't we turn it over to you, Ross? I know, CISA, you're reaching lots of different constituents, internal constituents, but a lot of external constituents. Great to catch up with you, by the way.
Yeah, it's great to see you, Tom. And look, thank you, ATARC, again. I mean, you guys are doing such great work for the federal government. We really do appreciate it. And thank you for having me here today. So maybe I ought to tell some of our listeners that I have a pretty broad mission at CISA, because CISA has mission beyond just its own agency. We help support the federal.gov and on the program I'm on, the Continuous Diagnostics and Mitigation Program, we do that in a pretty broad way. I won't go into much detail about CDM, but what I do want to talk about is another job that I have in the federal government. I'm also the co-chair for the Federal Mobility Group, the Derived PIV Working Group. And that is probably more applicable to what we're talking about today. And I'll talk more about that mission as well. And on top of that, I work at CISA, and when we ourselves are an agency that has, is dealing with telework. And I'll elaborate a little bit more on how we've done that too.
Tom, I think you might be on mute.
Hey, you know what? I do that like every third episode. I think the first time I started going in pandemic, I was on mute for 3 minutes. So that is a minor error in my world. But anyway, Jeremy, you didn't hear what I had to say, but good to have you, and look forward to your comments.
Thanks. Well, I'll say just to kick off, and I'm glad I stopped you, by the way, because I figured that might be coming my way, and I really wouldn't know what to say. As you mentioned, I spent some time at NIST and used to run the national strategy for trusted identities in cyberspace. Got to work with a few of you on this call. Now in my role at Venable, I work with clients in both the public and private sector, and I think one thing we've seen is drawing on themes across both of those. The response was really similar this year, or I guess last year now, back in March when everything suddenly shut down. I think it was a real shock to the system for both government and industry when offices were closed, when in-person transactions basically became verboten, and everybody had to figure out really quickly, how do you pivot to doing stuff at home in a way that's not just workable for people so they can actually get their job done, but also secure. And I think a common theme that we've seen in both government and industry is when we quickly went virtual overnight for a lot of organizations, the way their IT might have been architected, it really changed the attack surface quite significantly. And especially if you weren't set up, originally to be supporting a lot of telework. And one of the best ways to shrink that attack surface is using strong authentication. And I know, whether it's what we've seen in government, where we're tying in existing things like the PIV and the CAC to combined with VPNs, to in many cases where you weren't able to use those, and so you might have been using something as an alternative, say like a YubiKey. I think we've seen a lot of the same things in the private sector where you've been, seeing a bundle of VPNs and, really strong authentication as a way to provide a baseline of security to support the mobile workforce. And we can talk more about what some of that's look like and what that means as this whole thing goes on.
Thank you for that, Jeremy. And Jeff, love to hear your comments. I know that, it'd be great to compare and contrast what's going on across government itself, but then also in other industries. Great to get your insights.
No, absolutely. I mean, the past year have been very interesting in commercial and government. We've really been engaging with our customers and partners about how to provide strong, secure, trusted credentials in this work from home world that was really just thrown at us overnight. And, the government does have a lot of challenges because they do have the PIV cards and the CACs. And how do you update those or reissue those when folks can't do these in-person processes that are required currently? The commercial world is a little bit different. A lot of them don't have a strong authenticator already, so they can implement something and build a process brand new that works in this world. So, we've really been partnering with our government customers, which was my primary focus, on options for providing that strong credential on a trusted piece of hardware that they can use at home without a government furnished equipment. So their personal computer, instead of having to send them a PIV reader and middleware, use something else. In our case, obviously a YubiKey. But it's been quite a journey this past year. We've been quite busy, and it's been a pleasure working with a number of the folks on this call over the past year and helping them solve their problems.
Thank you, Jeff. So let's get into a few questions, at least one or two, and then we'll get into the polls. My first question is, how has COVID-19 impacted accelerated identity management within your agency or within the agencies that you deal with? And just some of the challenges that we faced during that process, and how do we overcome them, and any lessons learned? We've had about a year now, right? We've almost had about a year. And maybe I'll start off with you, Lisa, at USAID. How did this, in particular COVID, affect you guys?
Well, of course, the whole identity verification was a struggle. Still is a struggle until we get the right standards, the updated standards out of how do we change and implement new processes. But what we do, and not just for USAID, I think for a lot of agencies, is we're looking at how do we enforce that multi-factor strong authentication, smart authentication, with using like zero trust network access methods and concepts. What are you now accessing? Do you have to access, the entire network? Are you just accessing a resource? Where are you coming from? What type of authentication can we allow you to use? What's appropriate? And getting that to them, that token, that smart credential. So it's not that you want to deploy multiple technologies and have an ICAM operational burden, but you do want to look into more of those zero trust network access controls to be able to give the right person the access that they need and perform the identity proofing that goes with it. So that's what I hear a lot in the federal working groups and on our working group here as well that we talked about. And I think that's the direction that we're in.
Great. And how about you, Joe? You have similar issues with Lisa, but
yeah, we definitely do. I mean, identity proofing people is always a challenge, especially in our international offices. We have fairly high turnover in those offices, so we really lean very heavily on our partners in state to do the background checking of those folks. In some cases, just because of the timelines and the cost, we're not able to implement PIV. So we're trying to follow the spirit, if not the letter of the law, there by issuing those folks smart cards so that they do have multi-factor authentication. But we also, with our cloud deployment, are leaning into strong authentication on all of those platforms. So even if we're not doing direct PIV authentication, we can use a derived credential of some sort to do multi-factor authentication. And so we're still achieving strong authentication there. But that also helps to segment systems because you're only authenticating to that specific system, not to the whole environment. So segmentation definitely helps as well.
Great. And Ross, what are you hearing across the working group? And anything you're picking up in CISA, but
Yeah, so, well, first let me talk a little bit about CISA. We actually anticipated that we'd be in a telework position. And in fact, the week before everybody went in that position, we kind of did a trial run. So that was a good thing for us. You know, I appreciate our leadership. They're risk managers by trade, so they did a good job of, viewing down the road. I think, and CISA, I want to talk about, we already had issued derived PIV credentials to mobile devices. So that also gave us a real advantage here that, that we used the X5 and 9 derived PIV certificates on the phone, and that really helped us get to our cloud services, which we already have used as our service provider. So that helped us as an agency. We did have problems with, PIV issuance, right? So in the spring, CISA issued a directive that allowed us to issue derived alternate credentials, right? Something that wasn't a PIV, but it was the form factor is a smart card, similar to a PIV, and it allows people to do work on the network. They don't get PII, and they can't go into facilities with that, but it allows them to do some proofing, like Joe was talking about, without going in person, so that we can get people, going, particularly new hires, of which CISA has done a lot of that in the last year. So now I'll talk a little bit about the Drive PIV working group, right? And across the government, people have had to do the same things. Some agencies have had derived PIV on mobile devices, and so they could take advantage of that, but it wasn't as many as you might have wished, right? So each of those agencies have had to take their own approaches to try to get strong authentication, to get around the proofing processes if they can't do PIV, with some other risk assessment that they do, and accept the risk for what they're doing in this time of COVID. And I think that's the appropriate approach. And look, I really appreciate OMB, my own agency, for helping issue directives that supported that method, right? Rather than putting us in a situation that was an impossible situation.
Yeah, I think we saw early some agencies put some weird directives like, well, you can work remote, but you can't you got to worry about your kids. You can't have them in there, and it's like totally not reflective of reality. So, Jeremy, what do you want to add? I mean, you've got all this historical knowledge, and here we are, and things move probably more rapidly in the last year than it had probably the previous 10.
Yeah, I think a couple points. I mean, one, look, the government, which I think gets knocked sometimes for being behind the times, actually was way ahead of it in terms of embracing strong authentication with things like CAC and PIV, and, prioritizing, really strong, in this case, smart card and PKI infrastructure, far, before industry started to wake up to how important it was to get beyond password. So the PIV is the gold standard. The problem is that it's a little long in the tooth. I think if we were trying to do this today, we would not be investing in smart cards and PKI. We'd be looking to things like the FIDO standards, which just allow you to do things a little more simply, a little more cheaply. You have support embedded in devices and browsers, as opposed to being something that you need to bolt on with middleware or external readers or things like that. And with PIV, you also have the challenge that it presumes you can do in-person identity proofing, which again is the gold standard for what you want to do in the ID proofing world. Doesn't really translate so well if you're in a pandemic and it's not safe to do so. And so I think everybody's been scrambling, certainly within government. Well, how do we get something that's, as close to possible as PIV grade security, but make sure that, in some cases we might not be having people work on government computers. They might be working from a home computer. So, what are you going to be able to get them there? And, this is, I think, where things, companies like Ubico have been able to step in with FIDO security keys, which, what is FIDO? It's essentially a lightweight version of PKI, or some would say PK without the I being all the stuff that makes it expensive and complicated. And the ability to, get a, secure hardware token in their hands that's rooted in asymmetric public key cryptography, just like the PIV card, but it's a little simpler to deploy, is a way to help bridge the gap in a, overnight telework environment where you need to improvise a little bit, take advantage of some of the flexibilities that things like Memo 2019 gave you, and also just, deal with the realities of a workforce that is in a really different working environment. And, look, we're seeing it in the private sector as well, where, I mentioned this before, it's been the combination of, things like, MFA and VPNs that are being used to secure a lot of the new work environment we're in. I just want to pivot real quick before we, go on to the next question too, to talk about why authentication is so important. It's, year after year an anomaly when a major breach happens and identity doesn't provide the attack vector, generally a compromised password. Just this morning, I'm reading in the Washington Post, the Justice Department yesterday accused the North Koreans of working to steal more than $1.3 billion in cash and cryptocurrency. And as part of the attack, they pointed out that one of the things the attackers were doing were conducting spear phishing campaigns. I'm just reading the article right now, targeting U.S. defense contractors and aerospace and energy companies, as well as State Department and Pentagon officials, to try and spear phish them into giving up a password that could then let the hackers into their computers. So, I could have written the same story probably 10 years ago, minus the cryptocurrency part, but, whether it's organized crime or whether it's nation states who are trying to get into government systems, they go after the password almost every time. And so the ability to augment or, hopefully replace the password with something stronger, that's, something like, a hardware key, that makes all the difference in the world, because this can't be phished. My PIV card can't be phished, but a lot of other technologies can.
Right. Good point. Jeff, you want to add something here?
Yeah, I mean, pre-pandemic, things were well defined. People working from the office. Non-PIV credentials were the exception, not the rule. Overnight that had to switch. M19, 17 had come out a little bit before the pandemic, saying, "Hey, let's start looking at these alternate credentials, because there's cases where PIV and CAC just aren't the right thing." Obviously, that got upended very quickly, and I think once 2019 came out and said, "Hey, you are legitimately allowed to use non-PIV credentials," that the tide started turning, and NIST has really started to review 863 and FIPS 201 and say, okay, what are our options for non-PIV, non-CAC? How do we do identity proofing without personal appearances? And we've really worked hard at Yubico to build some integrations with some identity proofing vendors, some of the FIDO capabilities, enhancing those to make them more bulletproof and stronger for the federal market. And I think moving forward, this is going to really reset the landscape. And folks like the folks on this call are realizing, hey, we do have options now, and we need to figure out how to implement them properly in the government and provide that strong authentication.
Great. How about we, since we're on this topic, let's go, Alyssa, can we hit a couple of poll questions here that I think they're pretty pertinent, and then we'll start getting to the questions. How is your agency currently securing access for teleworkers? Select all that apply. Multiple choice. It's a multiple choice poll. I like these a little better. I like tests like this. I don't like the open essay ones. Okay. All right, we'll get that circulated there. It just takes a couple of seconds. These polls work pretty fast. Okay, let's see what the results are, Alyssa. Interesting. It's kind of all over the place.
At 29% username and passwords only is terrifying. My personal editorial.
And I think the point here is you need multiple solutions. You can't just pick one. You're going to have to support multiple, and that's where I think the security key technology is going to provide value to the government.
Yeah, I'm kind of with Jeremy. The 29% really sticks out. So
it is symptomatic, though, I think, of what we've seen, Tom, with sort of how would I describe it? Sort of the rut we've ended up in within government the last few years, which is that we put such a heavy focus on the PIV card, which, like I said, really is the gold standard. It's what we should strive to. But there's a lot of, use cases or, categories of employees or contractors that aren't going to be eligible to get one. And so for years, we've sort of been in this scenario where it's been PIV or bust, and meaning, bust is, well, we're just going to give you username and password. When the reality is there's a whole bunch of other things you can be using on top of a password that still are going to get you incrementally closer to the security level you get with PIV. And so it's a little, like I said, terrifying to see that we're still basically at 3 out of 10 respondents are saying that their agencies haven't done that yet.
yeah, I think mobile-based authenticators obviously have gone up. I mean, we're only about 10, 11 years into the smartphone era. Interesting.
I think a lot
Right.
of agencies, though, again, it's about the struggle with identity proofing and how do we get them a credential. Their PIVs are expiring. They don't have any way to come in. I mean, I know people are, setting up appointments and things like that in all the agencies, but I think that this username and password thing is probably increased because of COVID, absolutely. But I think it's because of the identity proofing, because we do have the technology available, like we've been talking about earlier, to get where we need to go. So it's definitely a process and policy goal that we have to get through.
Identity
So,
proofing outside of the United States in particular is a huge challenge. Often we're relying upon the foreign government that you're operating with, and some cases that may not be advisable, but that's all you can do.
Yeah, and I agree with you, Jeremy. I think, one of the things we have to train people to do is take a risk management approach to things so that, they don't feel like they're stuck someplace because they can't get to the high bar that somebody is in. They must get to, right? Getting off the floor is better than if you can't achieve the top of the rung, right?
Right. Good point.
And along those lines, having different levels of trusted credentials. So the folks outside of the country that have been identity proof through the foreign government maybe are provided a credential that isn't trusted as highly as a PIV. And then you can separate your access control and separate those folks out of the high security data and applications that they shouldn't be accessing with those low security credentials.
I agree. I think that now is a perfect example, right? They're getting some remote vetting, right? And they're getting some tokens. And when they can recover from this, they'll go ahead and finish getting a PIV card. And that's the right way to do it.
Yep. Interesting. How about we go to the next poll question, our second and final one of the day. Go ahead. Why don't we pop this up? What authentication challenges are you facing with remote workers? Select all that apply. So this is a little bit deeper here. All right, we'll get that out there. I'm sure that'll be. I'm can't wait to see what kind of feedback we get there. Alyssa, I think we've had enough time. There you go. So, yeah, I'm not surprised by that first one. I mean, there's a lot of, I'm not surprised by it. Anybody want to jump in and comment on this? Go ahead, Elisa.
But again, even on the first one, so there's other authenticators. There's other things that we could adopt to. And only give them certain type of access, like Joe said earlier, just to whatever they need. And we've been saying that a long time in the identity management world, the right person with the right resource, and don't have to log into the network to get to all of these things, but it is a struggle. One of the other things on here that's I'm surprised is low is the other. I mean, our operations world, what a shift that they have to take on moving into just implementing 1917, as we said earlier, but now, during this whole COVID pandemic, there are, skill sets changed. Things get more, manual processes go away, they turn into automated, which is what we were striving for anyway before COVID, but now it's just, such a push and a demand on the operations management part of ICAM. And that I see that as a very big struggle in many agencies.
Any other comments, Jeff, maybe?
Yeah, I think number one, obviously, is the non-PIV CAC eligible, which is, I think it's a larger population than most folks realize. And that's where newer technologies like FIDO can really come into play, because if you're not eligible for a PIV, your identity proofing bar is set a little lower, because obviously that credential isn't going to be trusted. Not surprised that identity proofing is the second one. That is a huge challenge in general. In most government agencies before the pandemic, you could go to the office and get your identity validated. It's not an option anymore. And, coming up with a lot of identity proofing options that, again, separate your levels of access and your levels of trust and get you a credential in a method that they can trust that the person who received the credential was supposed to get the credential. So it kind of makes sense to me, and that's what we've been seeing. This really jives with what we've been seeing in our world the past year. And I think we have a lot of good options coming down the pike, especially once NIST updates their documentation sometime in late 2021 or 2022.
Jeremy, you want to give us I know you don't work there anymore, but I know you're intimately familiar with this guidance.
I mean, they're working on a couple updates. I mean, one is the update to FIPS 201, and then the second is an update to Special Publication 863. I've been tracking the latter more than the former, but I think, they really tie closely together here. In that, I think one of the things FIPS 201 is going to do is point you to alternative authenticators if you can't use the PIV in certain circumstances. And I really think, again, looking at that second poll question, the top challenge is, 70% of people who are dealing with people who just aren't eligible for a PIV or a CAF. Well, what are you going to give them? I know one of the things NIST is looking at as they look at other authenticators relative to the way, they define, today, right now, it's 3 authenticator assurance levels. And one of the things they're starting to pay more attention to that I think is becoming increasingly important is phishing resistance of alternative authenticators. So PKI is great because it's based on asymmetric public key cryptography, which means I got a smart card in one hand and the private key is only here, and you can't trick me into giving it. I've got to sign a cryptographic challenge. FIDO works the same way. It's resistant to phishing attacks. What we're seeing, though, is that some of the legacy tools that we've been using for multi-factor authentication, things like one-time password codes that either can be texted to me or might just be generated by an app on my phone, even some of the tools, with push notification, depending on how they're architected, is you can essentially phish those as well. I mean, if I can trick you with, going back to that Post article from this morning, if I can, trick an official I'll pick on the State Department to give me their username and passcode, I can also give them a phishing attack that will trick them into giving over that one-time passcode that their phone app is going to generate afterwards. And the 30 seconds that that code is good for is good enough to take over the account. So I know that NIST has been talking about looking at how do you differentiate between non-PIV authenticators to look at those like FIDO that are phishing resistant versus those that, they might still stop a credential stuffing attack or, some other lower, level authentication attacks. But if you're dealing with a targeted spear phishing attack, you really need to go with something that's going to block those sorts of things.
Sure. It just reminds me, I think we talked about it last week, actually, where the DHS had they said this was, it's a little dated because, it was like when the Redskins may have been a little bit better, but they targeted.
They were still that name.
Yeah, well, at least they made the playoffs. They put the thing out, free Redskin tickets, and 60% of DHS clicked it within a minute, probably.
And to Jeremy's point, the commercial world has pretty much skipped the PIV smart card implementation because of the complexity. They went right from username and password to FIDO because it provides them a very strong PK or a public-private key cryptographic solution without having a lot of heavyweight things to implement and manage, which I think the government, the federal side of the business really, I don't want to say struggles, but spends a lot of energy, time, and effort to manage this PKI when there's newer option that will provide them the same security in a much easier to implement solution.
Yeah. Well, somebody just asked a question that goes into that. What avenues, and I'm going to direct this to you, Ross, what avenues are CIS and other federal agencies utilizing to identify and evaluate new authentication solutions? How is the government thinking about friction, as in adding steps to authentication? So I think it's a good point. Like, the technology's changed pretty fast here, and we're still trying to implement 20-year-old technology, right?
Yeah, I think, there's a lot of things in motion here. One of them are shared services, a focus on shared services across the government. And I think you may see some services coming out that can address this, right? And there's already services in play that can be enhanced and, let's just say, supported better, right? So that they can be utilized. Also, to the Derived PIV Working Group, I'll say that, we're reaching out to agencies. They, remember in M1917, they asked the Federal CIO Council to to let agencies run pilots, and they would help champion that. And that kind of got a little sidetracked last year because of the immediacy, and it didn't seem like, brokering pilots was the important thing to do other than letting people get their business done, right? But I think that's on the table again this year. And as an outcome of some of those pilots, we'll have a better idea of what we should recommend to agencies to use around these alternate authenticators. I also want to give a shout out to NSA, who early this year and released in, I think, July and updated in September, some evaluation that they did. It was market research, but they did good evaluation on, other multi-factor authenticators. And, Jeff, your product showed up there and many others. And that'll be part of what the Derived PIV working group does in this year is looking at agencies that are using those other authenticators. And we'll talk about how they get bound to the identity. That's really the key here, right? The thing that the PIV card gives us the best is it gives us identity verification that is immutable, right? And we can count on that. And no matter what other types of credentials we rely on after that, we can always assure that the person that was presented that authenticator was the person we expected to be. And that is really terribly important.
Lisa, I know you've been involved with some of the pilots, and I know we were talking about a little bit on the prep call. Where do you see this?
Well, I kind of see it the same way. I mean, we have to, which we're really waiting for FIPS 2013 to come out. We're looking at that, but we're trying to leverage, different types of authentication for different types of services. I see a lot going on, as we talked about a little bit earlier, with Zero Trust. I see a lot going on with updating, all of our standards, as we said earlier. But I see a lot of the vendors trying to meet the standards as well. I see, for instance, GSA is doing a great job. It's a citizens, it's non-PIV, but it's cross-agency digital identity for citizens. And how do we identity proof them? The United States Post Office is working with that pilot right now to get people into post office to do in-person identity vetting for a stronger, an IAL3 type assurance level. These are some of the pilots that are going on that probably we can leverage. Phone records. I mean, if we're in the mobile world and the phone is doing the authentication and so forth as the authenticator, looking up phone records, again, other methods matching the right assurance level to exactly what Ross said, validate that identity, and then let them access what they need to appropriately. So I think, again, we're saying it the same thing in many different ways, but it's what everybody's struggling with: financial, health, government, of course. That's where our focus is, and it's going to be exciting when FIDO comes out and can be deployed, and we could get back to Jeremy. You had mentioned this before, the password lists. Using a biometric. I mean, it took a long time to get rid of the password to go to PIN, and everybody loves that. Nobody wants to go back to password. Let's get to biometrics, and that's where we want to leap to.
Yeah.
Anybody?
Yep. No, I agree, Lisa. Joe, you want to add anything?
Yeah, we're looking right now. I was literally just talking to my CIO about implementing some sort of a security hardware security token. I would like to get something with biometrics, but we're not yet doing a pilot. I'd very much like to get into that though, because anything that makes the authentication easier for our users means they're more likely to use it and use it appropriately, and that makes everybody more secure.
Great. And Jeff, I know you're really interested in this topic for some reason. Yeah.
So, I mean, I think the new technologies, and once the guidance is released that allows these new technologies to be utilized in the government, I think it's going to make a lot of folks happy because, as Lisa said, everybody's used to the PIV and PIN today. FIDO provides you that same end user experience without all the overhead that we've always talked about PIV. And biometrics, I think, are going to start showing coming up in the discussions, because it is also a way to bind that credential to a human being. if I tell somebody my PIN, they could use my credential. Unless I'm going to cut off my finger, I can't really allow them to use my credential when I'm not with them. So those are going to provide a much stronger, secure authentication mechanism that, again, can be trusted at a higher level because it is a more biometric type solution.
Yeah, Jeremy, have you seen any kind of solutions over the years? Any kind of labs? Any kind of like? What's your thoughts?
I mean, the ability to do biometrics, tied with something like a cryptographic key has been around for ages. I mean, heck, back when I was in the vendor world, we implemented that for Treasury and Secret Service with a biometric match on card, unlocking an Entrust certificate. God, in like 2002, 2003. The concept's not particularly new. And even though there's biometric templates that are on the PIV and CAC, we are still using the PIN instead of the biometric, which, it's better than a long password, but biometrics are a little bit cooler. I know Ubiquitous has introduced a new security key that has a built-in biometric match. The other thing to talk about with FIDO is it's not just reliant on an external authenticator. You can integrate it right into your device. So, your, Android, Windows, iOS are all shipping with support for FIDO built in. Particularly for mobile applications, sometimes you might want an external key, particularly when you're trying to register a new device. But once you're on a device, you might be able, with some things in mobile, to leverage the built-in capabilities as well. And if you're familiar with like Windows Hello, to log in, which is passwordless, that's based on the FIDO standards. So there's a lot of different things happening there. I think what's changed is the fact that a lot of it's standardized now. I mentioned what we did, like, gosh, that's nearly 20 years ago. I'm getting old now. But that was all custom engineering, to be the first ones to deploy this in government. This was pre-HSPD 12 that they were doing this. Nowadays, it's a standard. And so I think, particularly for folks like Lisa or Joe or Ross or anybody on this, this webinar who's on the implementation side, it's not so much, could you buy the technology, but can you buy it in a way that's standardized from a lot of different vendors, and stuff's just going to work because it's integrated with the browser from the start and it's integrated with the devices, regardless of what kind of platform your employees and contractors are using.
Can I expand on a point Jeremy made?
Sure, Jeff.
He mentioned authorizing a device with, say, a YubiKey or a FIDO token. We're seeing a lot of interest in that from our customer base because BYOD is becoming more and more important and valid. So you want to provide them a strong authentication token like a FIDO key that they use to authorize their mobile device. I call it like the root of trust, which then allows them, say, 30 days of fingerprints or Face ID authentication, which then will time out, and then they have to reauthorize with their trusted credential again. I think that is also going to be a big play in the bring your own device world and the work from home on your personal computer world.
I think maybe what we need, Ross, and I'm directing it to you because we work with CISA on these kinds of issues, and by extension, I think the group that you're working on, is we've had this lab demonstration center concept that we did for TIC 3.0. We basically brought in 8 to 10 vendors. They all showed what they could do. ATARC didn't pick winner and losers, but the government got to see in private sessions what these vendors can do. I think we need an identity management demonstration center, and it can be in multiple places. It doesn't have, it's a concept, but allow vendors to do some creativity. Let the, it's almost like a market research thing. It's not like a sales pitch. It's more of a capabilities pitch. I think we really need to do that for identity, because I don't want to be here in another 10 years. And Jeremy, we got another 10 years on us, and we're still talking about identity management issues.
I'm ready to solve this and go do something else, man.
Yeah, we might have to solve something else, but hopefully we can do that. But I think we're going to have to take this offline and because there's so many new cool solutions out there that I think that we need to take advantage of.
Tom, I'll just say that I do think that, as Lisa's mentioned it twice, and I think she's spot on, zero trust architectures, it's about doing micro access management, access control decisions, right? That's what that really is about. Now, you get lots of signals, not just the kind of signals we've been talking about. There's going to be environmental signals, behavioral signals. Those will all be part of that. And, I mean, that is just emerging for the federal government, and and I'm looking to NIST and the NCCWE to, I think they're going to do some things this year. I think you guys have done some things as well. So I really do look at that a lot, and I talk a lot about those capabilities being aggregated together to give us, better, stronger signals from many different, devices.
No, I couldn't agree with you more. We got a couple questions. PIVCAC are only a portion of the answer to CIA repudiation. Thus, the existence of a PKI varied by agency. COVID has amplified the fact that obstacles exist and are preventing agencies from accomplishing reasonable, achievable means to achieve CIA non-repudiation to their sources on-prem or cloud. How are these obstacles being addressed so agencies can implement them quicker or sooner? Maybe start off with you there, Ross, and then we can get some comments from everybody else.
Yeah, so non-repudiation is a pretty big topic, right? And I think the most direct, the PIV card does provide really strong non-repudiation when it's used to sign documents and those kind of things. But it's not the only way you can do that. You have to have strong controls around what other things you're using to ensure that they're not being spoofed, and that's more complicated, right? I think there's still work to be done there around digital signatures, for instance, and other things that require strong non-repudiation that we just haven't addressed fully yet.
Right. Lisa, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, sure. So, like there was a thing called with NIST, like PIN OAs, right? Especially around digital signature for non-repudiation. If you used your signature, you needed to put your PIN in, and it was a cryptographic challenge. How are we doing that today with strong multi-factor authentication? It gets built in. Again, like what Ross is saying too, we're all saying this, the security controls. Can I do this on a BYOD? Can I do it on a GFE? What am I using to do my transaction? Where am I coming from? All of those kinds of behavioral controls that you set up. So we can get to that non-repudiation, as we have been, just making sure that we have the right controls in place when the identity is there and we're validated.
Right. Joe?
So we're still relying very heavily on PIV and the certificates in PIV. I think there's some interesting work being done with blockchain, but I think there's still a lot of work left to be done there to really rely upon blockchain for non-repudiation in most situations. But I think it's an interesting area to look into, and maybe that's kind of the future.
We do have a blockchain group, a security group, and it's got some real colorful characters in that one. It's very interesting. It's one of the most interesting things we're doing these days. Jeff or Jeremy? How about you, Jeremy? We'll go with you first. So Jeff will back clean up.
Nothing too much to add to what's been said. I think this group's covered it pretty well.
Good. Jeff, anything?
Yeah, I just wanted to add, a concept of attestation. So putting information on the key, a certificate on the key that you, the agency, has trusted. That certificate is used to sign credentials that are generated on the key. So you're confident that those keys and public and private keys have been generated on the physical device. So then you have a lot better trust in that credential, which then of course goes to the whole non-repudiation. The person who presented that credential, it's a legitimate, valid, trusted credential. And the person, maybe it's a biometric, maybe it's still the PIN. The person has used that credential in a way we expect. So now we trust that person performed the action, and they can't go back and say, no, they didn't do it.
Great. Remember when I said we didn't have any more poll questions? We actually have one more. So I didn't read my own script. So we got some good ones on this one. So if we can put the next one up, what does passwordless login mean to you? That is the question. There you go. See, somebody put some thought behind these today. I got to give them credit. So we're making our audience really think here. Okay. All right. I think now that one I promise is the last question of the day, but they've been good so far. All right. What do we have, Alyssa? Okay. What does mean, Jeremy? What do you think?
Means we're divided. Nothing stood out.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I think it could be all of those, which is probably why we're divided.
Yeah. Interesting. Any other comments from anybody? Yeah.
I agree. I think I would like to get away from the whole password thing, even the initial password, even though it's encrypted and hashed and so forth. But, look at the SolarWinds, right? If you don't have that password, completely secured, things happen. So I think again, following with our standards, being strong identity proofing, with strong identity proofing standards, the right device, the right place. Can we move away from passwords totally?
Right. Jeff, anything there you want to add?
Yeah, I think there is definitely confusion over what passwordless means. I mean, smart cards are passwordless. You could disable, today's world, you could disable or enable the password only or smart card only authentication mechanism in Active Directory. Great. FIDO, very great also. So I think we just, as an industry, we probably need to better define what that means. Technologies have really been there for a while. It's just a new buzzword. And I think we failed in making sure everybody understood what it meant.
Great.
And I do think with that, one reason you're seeing confusion is a lot of passwordless that's being deployed is still going to have a password somewhere deep at the back end that might be used, in a small subset of use cases. I think for a lot of people, it's really how do you get away from passwords day to day versus something that's truly passwordless, can provide, some great efficiencies, some great security, but sometimes when you start thinking about, well, how am I going to do account recovery or log into a new device, that starts to create some other challenges that you might not be truly 100% post-password.
Yeah.
Valid point, Jeremy.
Yeah, I think we probably focus more on the government employees and contractors inside the federal space. How about let's shift a little bit to the citizens, because that's a really challenging area there. And or our constituents of any kind, just some of the challenges that we faced maybe during pandemic. I know the Social Security Administration, hey, when I have to wheel my 96-year-old grandmother into the Social Security office and she's got her driver's license, okay, I can verify her. We're in this new world now. And maybe Lisa, I know you all have some experience in that area. What are some of the challenges that we have there?
Well, again, user behavior, right? Not everybody, even if you push the easiest mobile app to a user, I mean, it's still, they got to configure it. They still have to set it up and things like that. You could have multiple, multiple push or verifiers on your phone. Are you picking the right one for what you have it tied to, the right application, so forth. So I think the not educating is not the right word, but supporting the citizen, and it starts when they register. It starts when they register for what the purpose is that they need to even whatever purpose it is that they want to access. As they register, they go through the look and feel of it, and then they understand it better. But it is important for for us to, or the responsible party to put out such an app or a mechanism, one of the leading technologies, to be able to support any of that authentication, because the end user won't know if it's a deprecated SMS push to a strong FIDO key, mobile push or secure key. So I think that's important, and it's a struggle. Again, that operational and user back end is a struggle.
Great. How about you, Joe? I know you guys deal with external constituents all the time.
We do. We've looked at using login.gov or some sort of central repository. I think that's sort of the ideal situation, is if we had something that would be cross-agency that we could use. But I mean, ultimately, you can't enforce that. So to some extent, you're relying upon the public to choose the authentication or the identification that they're comfortable with. And some people are very uncomfortable with that. I mean, we've had a lot of challenges with people who feel that they're being tracked or something like that. And so they're not willing to engage in some sort of a central repository. So I think it's always going to be a challenge as long as that's the case.
Mhm.
And
Ross,
Tom, I'll add
go ahead.
that as a citizen, I actually also have used ID.me, and it's allowed me to get access to government services without using a government entity, right, to help me. And I think both of those services are great. And I'm a big advocate of using services, right, instead of creating this over and over and over again.
No, I agree. How about Jeremy? You want to add anything?
I think the identity proofing side of the equation is the hardest problem in identity right now. I know we've been talking a lot about authentication. I'm bullish that we're solving that problem. With things like FIDO, I can tell you a few different ways on how to architect something that's really secure and passwordless. And, industry has worked with government to create that next generation of technology and standards. Identity proofing, we're almost going in the opposite direction in that the legacy stuff, like knowledge-based verification tools that we were using, the attackers have caught up with. And there's a lot of other innovative tools that are out there. One of the challenges with identity proofing is the government's the only authoritative issuer of identity, but a lot of what they do is stuck in the paper and plastic world. And the companies who are innovating in this space to try and figure out if you really are who you say you are and not the proverbial dog on the internet are all trying to guess what only the government really knows. And so I do think that the way we're ultimately going to address this is to create new ways to try and bring some of these government authoritative systems into the digital era, where any of us could ask an agency who's already issued us a credential, like a driver's license, a passport, to vouch for us when we're trying to prove who we are online.
True. How about you, Jeff?
Yeah, I
Great-
think one
great point,
of the
Jeremy.
big issues is the technological savviness of the citizens. I mean, let's take the VA. They're a great example. They got 26 million plus veterans. You've got the 96-year-old World War II vet who barely knows how to use a phone, and he needs to get his benefits. And then you got the 25-year-old, former Marine who grew up with computers and phones, so he gets it. So how does a government agency provide a service, a strong authentication service to its citizens that can handle the huge disparity in that savviness that we see in the citizen side of the house?
Yeah, it's tough. You got to know your users.
Yeah.
How about this? We're getting close to the end already. Wow, I just looked at the time. I'd be going on here forever. This is such a great conversation. Let's look at what do we think we can get done this year. I know everybody's been planning out their 2021, and what kind of predictions can we make that we can get done this year? How about we start with you, Lisa?
Okay, I think definitely mobility is definitely huge, and everybody's involved with it. The derived credentials, getting the policies out there. They've been out for public comment to support our GSA and NIST teams to get them pretty finalized. I think privileged access management is something we didn't really touch on, but all users need to be secured, right? But privileged access management, I think, is another thing agencies are looking at across the enterprise. Again, not one technology is going to be able to satisfy the whole, all the use cases. We talked about it earlier. We might have to do a hybrid approach. But I think privileged access management is on the rise where we struggled in the past, and mobility.
Great. How about you, Joe?
I think we're going to continue the movement we've been making into the cloud, modernizing a lot of our legacy systems and moving them into modern SaaS and PaaS platforms. Deployment of biometric smart tokens would be very, very advantageous. I'd like to have something that would do biometrics and would also be available on mobile, because especially with as many people as we have in the field, mobile is going to be a very important part of our strategy.
Yeah. And Ross, I know you got internal and external.
I do. So on CDM, our goal is to finish completing the master user record at the agencies, and to make more progress on the privilege management side, right? Lisa's exactly right. And then on the derived PIV working group side, we hope to have 2 agencies demonstrate alternate authenticators, right, other than the X509s, and show the binding of those authenticators to the PIV identification. And I think that's going to be that'll be really great to have those in our pocket by the end of the year.
Fantastic. Those would be great action items. Jeremy?
So I got 3 things I think we can do this year. One is going back to that first poll question. 29% of people are teleworking right now with only username and password. Let's get them a YubiKey or something else that's strong that they can use to protect themselves. Really, it's not that big a deal given that we've gotten the other 70% somewhat secure. The second that I think might help with it, this actually might be a little homework for you, Ross, or some of your colleagues at CISA. So I just threw in the chat, there was a question about a half hour ago, has CISA put guidance out on alternative authenticators? Interestingly, CISA back in September put out guidance on this, but it was focused on election organizations. And they talked a lot about MFA, and they specifically said, you need to be using MFA for all user email accounts. And they, called out physical security keys are what you want to do first because they can protect against phishing attacks. And then called out other authentication apps that it might be smartphone based. Said, look, they are still vulnerable to phishing attacks, but they're going to offer more protection than nothing at all. I haven't seen any guidance like that coming out for agencies. And it would be good to see some of that language maybe cloned and packaged into something that could give some guidance to those. As I said before, we got 30% of people who are only doing this with a password right now. Maybe they need a little more guidance beyond what OMB and NIST have given them so far. And I'd love to see CISA do something. And then the third is I'm hoping Congress is going to pass a bill that got introduced last year, the Improving Digital Identity Act, which looks a little at authentication, but much more at this identity proofing issue. And the challenge I was talking about before, it would really start to take a whole of government approach to what can federal, state, and local all do to develop better identity proofing services that can work in combination with tools in the private sector. We just had a forum a couple of weeks ago. That bill should get introduced soon in the House and Senate. And I'm 24 years in DC. You'd think I'm cynical that nothing can get done, but I'm bullish that's going to happen this year.
And who's sponsoring it?
It was introduced last year by Bill Foster, who's a Democrat from Illinois, and John Katko, who's a Republican from New York, who's now the ranking member on the House Homeland Security Committee. Jim Langevin and Barry Loudermilk were also a DNR that sponsored it on the House side. The Senate, I can't say yet whose name's going to be on it, but I think it's going to be a good bipartisan mix of people as well. So we're pretty bullish on that.
Good stuff. And Jeff, you get the last word.
Thanks. I think there's two areas. As Lisa said, the mobile is a big deal. I mean, that is, I think, the number one area that we're struggling in right now. I think you'll see a number of things coming out in the next few months that are really going to enable strong authentication on mobile from all kinds of vendors, Yubico, Apple, Microsoft, Entrust, et cetera. So I think we got a good shot at getting something there. And the last piece is FIDO. I think Microsoft, they're hopefully going to release their FIDO solutions very soon. And I think that's the kick in the pants we really need to get FIDO out in front of the federal market so they can start testing it and kicking the tires and realizing that it can be as secure as the current PIV implementations. Yes, there's some challenges we still have to overcome, but I think it's a viable option moving forward.
Great. Thank you for that, Jeff. And unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today. Thank you for our partners at Yubico and this great panel. Thank you, Jeremy, Ross, Jeff, Joe, and Lisa. We appreciate your time. Thank you so much. And next week, I'm affectionately calling it the ATARC channel. We have our 2021 DevOps Virtual Summit, and we've got a great. We start off with a fireside chat with Laura Nossenberger, and then we have a great all-star panel. And it kind of reminds me, it was like a year ago, March 10th, where we had the DevOps Summit. And that was the last in-person event that ATARC has done. It's hard to believe a year's blown by so fast. But anyway, everybody have a great rest of the afternoon. Thank you for joining us today, and have a great week.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.